Welcome, everybody, to our inaugural Semali Symposium on Indigenous Knowledge as part of our conference at the part of our CIES conference. My name is Tutaleni Asino, and I am an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University. And full disclosure, Dr. Semali is my PhD advisor, and I will just like to hear declare to the world that he is the one responsible for my hair loss through that whole PhD process. Nonetheless, I think we are all very excited to have this session today because Dr. Semali has been at the forefront of this conversation around Indigenous knowledge in the academy. He's been at the epicenter of the various debate, just not just in terms of the on how we talk about Indigenous knowledge, but how we position ourselves as researchers in the field, and fighting for space in the academy, and particularly in CIES. So we are very excited to have this symposium and to name it after him as one of the founders of the IKA SIG in CIES. So we're really happy and excited to have him join us, because one of the things that I find out is that once people retire, they become more busy and you can never get a hold of them. So the fact that we have him here today, we are very excited about that. As it was said earlier, this is a time of uncertainty and unpredictability, which is causing us very much to shift in so many different ways that we didn't even know we were able to shift before. So we were hoping for this to be a big rollout event at the conference in Miami, but of course that is not able to happen. But we are so very honored as a SIG to have everybody here to join us for this. And because we had to move this online, we sort of shifted a little bit on the format of how we're going to be doing that. So rather than having a traditional lecture on the symposium, what we're going to do is we'll give Dr. Semali an opportunity to just make an open statement, and then we'll go through and basically engage in a conversation. I have some questions that I'll be posing to him, but what we are hoping as a SIG is that this will be more of a back and forth conversation in the end. So with that, Dr. Semali, welcome again. Thank you for joining us and being flexible with our shifting tides. And I'm not going to apologize for the last minute way that I've been communicating with you, because you should be used to this by now as your student. So, and I know you're going to get back at me in some form or another later to make up for that. So, but thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours to make remarks for your namesake symposium.
Very good. And how much time do you allow me to talk before we open it up for questions and discussion?
We're gonna. How about we're thinking about 20 minutes?
20 minutes max. Okay, I will try to stay within that framework. Okay. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for thinking of me and inviting me to this August and very, very important symposium. I am delighted to see your faces here, to see Indri, to see Rebecca, and to see to hear from Rebecca, to hear from Marshall. Marshall, I haven't seen for quite a while, and the rest of you. So this is encouraging. This is encouraging to know that there is an interest out there to keep the fire burning, to pass the baton, so that the the idea does not die on the vine, and so we keep it alive, particularly in CIES. And for this reason, then I register my thanks to you for making the time to join this session, and also for keeping Indigenous knowledge and the SIG alive. Thank you. Now, the challenges we face today with education, with science, with intergroup relationships, multicultural education, and all, they all really demand that we think more carefully, and we, particularly those of us who have fire in the belly of promoting Indigenous knowledge at the SIG level, at our institutions level, and in our research and writing, we really need to remember that this is not an easy journey. The battles we fought to get this SIG on the books as a registered SIG for CIES was not an easy or should not be taken for granted. That's what I would like to share with you. There are always forces out there trying to stifle the voice of Indigenous peoples, to stifle the scholarship of Indigenous researchers, and also to pick on the vocabulary that we as a team try to educate the people, giving them the lexicon of how to deal and talk about Indigenous knowledge without feeling the stigma that is attached to the word Indigenous. And so for the many years of my own scholarship, the struggle was to find a language to explain the issues that surround the knowledge bank that we call Indigenous knowledge. And it seems to me that even with all this scholarship that has been underway, there are still forces out there that think we should not talk about anything such as Indigenous knowledge. Thank God to the folks in New Zealand, under the leadership of Linda Smith and her team, that have persisted in forging ahead with the scholarship on Indigenous knowledge. Now, and before I forget, they just came out with a new book. It's called Handbook on Indigenous Education. So you should check that out. It is an anthology. Many scholars contributed to this book, and again, I'm happy to see this, because then it reinforces what I'm talking about, what I'm saying here, that we have to keep the conversation going. So the first thing I want you to think about is, how do you come to terms, you as an individual researcher, you as an individual person, coming from a place that is indigenous to you and your fellow community members? How do you come to terms with this whole notion that you are indigenous? And so once I throw that out there, then what comes to my mind is, then we should not be frozen. We should not be frozen in this notion of of indigeneity, but rather be liberated through knowing that you have an identity that is associated with a place, an identity that is associated with a heritage, and an identity that is connected to a history and a language that you can call your own. My friends, through that statement, what I'm trying to say is indigenous knowledge is about indigenous ways of knowing. It is about indigenous ways of thinking. It is about heritage knowledge. It is about heritage history. It's about natural history. It is about local history of science. You see, every indigenous community has its own science. And as a community, they have been able to manage their natural environment for millennia. And for some reason, someone to come out and say, well, indigenous knowledge does not exist, then it's negating and refusing to see or acknowledge the existence of thousands and thousands of people who have lived comfortably in their own environment and manage that environment with their indigenous science. My struggles with indigenous knowledge then, and the desire to have the academy get involved, is because of this passion that I have, that the world is less. Our academy is less if we live out this entire knowledge system that I happen to be part of. And so then I would say, what do we do then? What do we do? We should continue to do what we are doing. We should continue to press on that the SIG thrives in the academy, that it attracts younger scholars, younger researchers who can expand the knowledge, expand the ways of knowing, expand the ways of thinking, expand the ways of talking about the environment we live in ways that it represents all and most of the indigenous peoples. It means also to begin to think about ways of integrating IK, indigenous knowledge, across the curriculum, because it's the young people who have been programmed to fear their heritage, who have been programmed to ignore and despise their own local languages, that have been labeled as if as Creole, that they are not worthy to be recognized as a language. One of the things that the new book that I just told you about, the Handbook of Indigenous Education, edited by Elizabeth McKinley and Linda Smith, is they have a whole section in that book about colonialism. And there are those folks in the academy who think that colonialism was a thing of the past And I have heard it in some quarters that after all, colonialism was not that painful after all. You gained something. Folks, those who have been under the yoke of colonialism know it, that it was painful, that it was disparaging, that it was dehumanizing, and that it was not for progress. If it was not for the fire of indigeneity, of the indigenous forces that were within these communities, we would not have overcome and conquered colonialism. Let me quickly then talk about what roles can you play in a variety of ways as members of the academy. And I was very pleased, actually humbled and really pleased to hear the institutions where you come from and the kind of the research you're working on and you're intending to work on. And so I really feel encouraged. But then two things I want to emphasize here. One, we should keep our solidarity. We should keep our association. We should keep the SIG, because the SIG gives us the energy to convene others, people of the same mind, to listen to the research that we are undertaking, and also to strengthen and make it grow. And by doing that, we attract others into the scholarship. Number two, I think, and this particular way of thinking about Indigenous knowledge scholarship or heritage knowledge scholarship brings into it then what I mentioned earlier, the vocabulary, the language to explain the concepts, to explain the philosophy, as Ndri was talking about, to explain the environment in which we live, to explain the ecology, the togetherness, you know, that this world is not monocultural, it's multicultural. And as a multicultural world, we have to accept diversity. We have to accept multiple ways of knowing. We have to accept the many dimensions that we bring into that knowledge bank that fuels and drives the world today. Let me tell you, as I think about the COVID-19, the coronavirus thing, indigenous peoples have known that there are viruses out there that have no name, but they knew the ways to treat them. Because they were immersed in the environment, they were immersed in the ecology. They knew the balance that needs to be there between what we eat, the air we breathe, and also the antioxidants that are in our system that need to be balanced, balanced by nature. And so, as I was reading the other day, I discovered that, actually, there has been some herbal remedies that would address a virus like this one. And of course, the pharmaceuticals would like to put their hands on it and own it and patent it and then make the rest of us pay for it. Now, this is an issue that I want you to think about. How do we protect? How do we protect with your scholarship, with your indigeneity? How do you protect that which is indigenous? So, in order to enable the academy then to move forward, remember the first book that we put out on indigenous knowledge was Voices from the Academy. I want you to continue to do that, to make those voices from the academy be heard. Introduce issues of integration in the classroom, where students are are encouraged to be comfortable, to talk about their cultural heritage, to talk about their cultural languages, to talk about the knowledge that has been handed from the ancestors, you know, about indigenous medicine, about indigenous science, about indigenous history. You know, all these have to be kept alive, my friends. I'm also encouraging you to continue writing. I mean, this symposium in ordinary times, in normal times, probably you would have thought of putting together, you know, a book that summarizes the ideas from the academy, what the academicians think about their own heritage, about their heritage history, about their identity as indigenous peoples, and share that with the world. So, and with such then, the symposium then grows into conferences. You know, folks in Montreal, folks in Cameroon, or in Africa, or in other places, and places like where you come from, Mr. Mong, you know, to think about how can we pull together the ideas from all these different places into a conference. I remember way back in 2004, we had the first international conference that pulled people from all over the world to talk about the issues. At that time, we were just beginning to develop the vocabulary, to feel comfortable with the language with which to express the ideas about cultural heritage knowledge, about indigenous knowledge, and talking about it without fearing any stigma attached to the word indigenous. And I'm happy to report that this has grown, and you have taken on the baton and you're running. Keep on running. Keep on running. So to sum up then, let me say, I would summarize it by three things. One, I encourage you with what you're doing. Continue to keep this SIG alive. By keeping it alive, you attract younger scholars to join and keep the fire burning. You do that through scholarship, through research, what you're doing, and through establishing a symposium like the one you have established here, and through establishing or convening conferences with a specific theme on indigenous knowledge. Second is the issue of integration. Integration must be part of the curriculum, must be part of the science that we teach, must be part of STEM classrooms, simply because indigenous science cannot be peripheralized. It cannot be in the because people live that indigenous life, indigenous science, and so and it is the focus. When you look at the pharmaceuticals, all the medicines that we have on the market today, they started from indigenous peoples. Very few of those medicines that are in tablet form today came from nowhere. They started with indigenous peoples. And so we integration then of science, of indigenous knowledge into science, STEM science, is really, really very important. And it is you, the scholars of tomorrow, of today and tomorrow, that can do this. And finally, the third point is that cultural heritage knowledge and the way we look at it should not represent a legacy of the past, but rather it should be a part of our own living that is irreplaceable source of life and inspiration for living in the present and for the future generations. It is the fire that keeps us going. It is the energy that we harvest from our own indigenous ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of thinking, and ways of communicating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Semali. I don't know where to start, so we're gonna just give a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was furiously taking notes, trying to figure out a way to sum up what you said. And I'll admit right off the bat that I will fail at that task because you have given us a lot of nuggets to think about. But I think I want to just briefly go back to what you ended on, where you're encouraging us to continue with the SIG, not just because of the fight that went in to establish it, but also because of the necessity to continue the conversation and encourage younger researchers to contribute to that conversation. And for us to keep in mind that we're going to grow as a SIG, not just by having small meetings, but by also engaging in scholarships in our research, in promoting different conversations through whether it's publications and hosting our own other symposia and so forth. I really like the recommendation and rather a note for us to remember that the goal for the SIG was always also about integrating IK into the curriculum. And for us to be aware that cultural heritage should not just represent a way of the past, but a way of living right now. So I thought those were really great points for us to remember. And I also wanted to highlight some of the things that, one of the things that stood out to me earlier is this idea of, as an Indigenous researcher, how do you position yourself? How do you come to terms also, especially if you yourself are Indigenous, how do you come to terms with this idea of being Indigenous, and for us not to be so frozen in time when it comes to the term Indigenous, and that to remember that you have an identity that is associated with a place, with a culture, with language that you can call your own. So again, those are just some very, very minor things that I picked up from a very well articulated opening of our conversation. I have about 2 or 3 questions that I wanted to pose to you that as a SIG we discussed yesterday. And I think for us really what would be interesting is that often I think the academy is guilty for this in so many different ways, that often we find finished papers that we read and we point to as seminal work, but no one really goes about how did you start with the first word and how did you end with that last word and everything else that goes in there. So it's good to say keep the fire burning, but it will also help us to know sort of how you came to this conversation. So our first question really is, how did you start in this area of research and Indigenous knowledge?
Well, it was by accident. It was by accident in the sense that my doctoral dissertation was about communication. It's about reading, writing, and literacy. And when I was in the field, I had an epiphany. That is, the epiphany came with this big clash between what I know and what the academy was telling me I need to know. So, it all converged around the word literacy. The question was, what is literacy? And yeah, it was not about letters. It was not about reading and writing. It was beyond reading and writing. It's about knowing. And it's at that time that I was able to connect with my own ancestors, my own grandfather, who was a judge. And he did not read or write, but he was a very good judge. And he adjudicated, you know, I was privileged just to see the tail end of his life. But what I saw stayed with me forever. And that is, there was a knowledge base. There was a communication skill that was embedded in his personality, in his head, in the way he gestured, in the way he articulated the words, and the memory that was able to store the different views and evidence that was brought by a variety of witnesses without writing it down. And so I realized that, well, there is a bank of knowledge here that is being missed out when we begin to couch literacy in such limited terms, which were actually a colonized way of thinking about the world, that the world is a world of reading and writing. Now, that was a revolution in a way, because then I began to pay attention to the local knowledges, to the local languages, to the local ways of knowing, local ways of thinking, and local ways of acting. And that came together then as an indigenous knowledge, a cultural heritage knowledge. And so when I went to one day I went to a conference, and at that conference I said, well, I'm interested in, folks, I'm interested in the study of indigenous knowledge. And everyone, I saw many hands of what is indigenous knowledge? What is indigenous? Everyone was asking and said, well, okay, maybe we should have a small meeting where we put our ideas together. And there we were. We went to this little meeting and we saw the need. And so we exchanged the ideas there, and we published the very first book, that is What is Indigenous Knowledge? Voices from the Academy. That's how we came to this.
Fantastic, thank you for that. For those just recently joining us, welcome to our Semali Symposium on Indigenous Knowledge as part of the CIES virtual conference. I can keep going with so many different questions, but I'll behave and pause myself here and open it up to other people to ask some questions as well. So the floor is open for additional questions. If you leave me quiet, I'll just keep going.
I can go now. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Semali, for sharing your wisdom and in inspiring us. I have been sitting here and listening, and many of these things echo in my own experience. What you see in the background picture I have is my latest book talk and a exhibit at Gardner Library at Harvard University. It's about, title is Indigenous Stories, and how stories matter, and also indigenous education, and as well as language revitalization, the work that we have been doing. So I think that one of the challenges we face in many places, when they see or hear about indigenous community, there is a perception is, oh, these are a small group of minority people. But I found that in my work is if we put all those indigenous people in the world in one country, it would be the third most populated country in the world. So as far as indigenous population goes, we have big population combined, as well as variety. I mean, over 80% of the languages spoken in the world. When it comes to indigenous ways of knowing, when we say this, often it is a question viewed as a methodology. We have faced challenges in terms of getting it recognized in the academia. So there are professors of literacy, professors of social studies, professors of psychology, but there are very few professors of indigenous studies or indigenous education in many universities around the world. So this is a challenge that we face, that as our students come in for their doctoral work or graduate work, there are very few faculty members. So I feel that we need to find a way to develop more scholars and supporting it. The question I have is that how you suggest developing more indigenous scholars or scholars from any part of the world, but focusing on indigenous education and indigenous studies. The second question is, the indigenous ways of knowing is not just indigenous, is a methodology. Often it's viewed as a methodology, and indigenous knowledge is viewed as a content. But what I hear from you, and please correct me, is that for us, is both of them are combined, the content and methodology. You cannot take just one and then separate from the other. So I think that how you see this, and both the content as well as methodology for our scholars who do the field work, I think that is probably also a good things to take or learn and hear from you. Thank you.
That's an interesting question and comment, and I find it insightful in a way, but I will address it by commenting on three points. One is the issue of who are the indigenous experts? Who are they? Before we get into who the scholars are, let's look at who are the experts. In my previous work, I have raised the question: what is indigeneity, and who is indigenous and who is not? And of course, that spurred a lot of conversation, healthy conversation for that matter. And the point is, first and foremost, we have to be aware of those folks who declare themselves to be experts of indigenous knowledge. Those who claim to be, they know it all about indigenous knowledge. Let me tell you, I met very, very, very illustrious people, very, very intelligent people in the course of my scholarship, my academy, my interactions with the academy. I met Oscar Kawagli from Alaska. This gentleman, he's passed on now, but he was at the University of Alaska, and his work was actually trying to pull together to sensitize the academy in how to integrate knowledge into the curriculum. How do you engage how do you engage the community to feel comfortable at the academy, and the academy to feel comfortable in going to the community? And we came up with the terms enrich and outreach. The university is interested in outreach for its scholarship, but it's not interested in enrich, where it is enriched by the knowledges of the community that surround the physical place of the university, even though they harvest the resources of that community, in the academy, including occupying the sacred lands that belonged to indigenous peoples. Now, I say beware of those who claim to be experts and those who claim to be the prophets of indigenous knowledge, because there is none. Because indigenous knowledge is not homogeneous. Indigenous knowledge is not specific. It's not universal. And there's no such a thing as universal knowledge anyway. Only the academic claims that and makes us believe that it is. But we know it comes from a variety of, it's just like you have a bottle of honey. That bottle of honey tastes beautiful, but contribution is from many, many bees, and actually not from only one hive, many hives. So let's take that metaphor to help us think this through. Now, so those who claim to be experts of indigenous knowledge and have interacted with have never been to an indigenous knowledge community, don't speak the language of the indigenous knowledge community, do not know the culture or the customs of the indigenous community. They have not lived in a substantial period of time with these communities. Now, how do they become indigenous? How do they become indigenous? And that is the first chapter in that book that I'm referring to, What is Indigenous Knowledge? The Voices of the Academy. To debunk this way of thinking that everyone can become an expert of indigenous knowledge without actually participating in situ the energy of that indigenous knowledge. Now, there are those then, those who call themselves experts, you will still meet with them. The ones who will discourage you from any scholarship, any dissertation that is related or that has something to do with indigenous peoples or indigenous heritage, or history of indigenous science. They'll discourage you. And they'll try to put stigma on it so that you feel ashamed that even you have this kind of thoughts, these dirty thoughts called indigenous knowledge. My friends, so we have to be aware that these so-called experts are there to derail the movement, to derail the cause, and to weaken indigenous peoples so that they do not rise up to claim their rights. Now, Mong, you mentioned about the population of indigenous peoples. Actually, when you look at Africa, only 20% of the population in Africa lives in cities. The rest, 80%, live in rural communities. I am working on a book right now on poverty, and this book echoes a lot of the things that we're talking about here in terms of indigeneity. And the question we are asking is, once upon a time, these communities, 80%, used to be wealthy, used to be self-reliant, used to be independent. So what happened? Why are they poor? Why are they stuck? You know, why are they not able to harvest the natural resources of their country or countries? I'll give you a quick example. A quick example is from my home country, Tanzania. Tanzania is rich with all kinds of minerals. And there is no community, there is no family that has a piece of land that there's no minerals underneath. And yet, these people are poor, are hungry. They don't have enough to eat. Well, foreigners and foreign companies come and harvest all that heritage wealth only to sell it elsewhere, make profits on them, and those profits are not shared by the people who have conserved this land for all these years. And our leaders, African leaders, think that it's okay. So my friends, and so who can voice? Those are some of the mistaken ways of thinking about indigeneity, particularly when it is in the hands of those who call themselves experts. The second part is ways of knowing as content and methodology. That's an interesting observation, actually, because when you ask yourself, what is the indigenous inspired methodology for research? That brings me back to my grandfather as a judge. How did he collect information, evidence, and be able to coalesce it, to pull it together, to be able to determine who is right, who is just, who is not, the plaintiff or the defendant? So I ask myself that what method did my grandfather use to collect that knowledge and be able to sustain and convince people to go home that justice has been served? My friends, there is so much we don't know. There's just so much we don't know. I taught a class at Penn State. It's called Participatory Action Research, or Participatory Research. And for some people thought that you could actually put parameters and say, okay, this is what participatory action research is, and here are the steps that you can follow, and here is this is how you frame the evidence, and this is how you frame the analysis, and this is how then you can justify the results. And I usually say that actually participatory action research has no conclusion, has no end. It is a cycle. It's a cycle.
Right.
You go through one cycle and you discover something, and from what you discover, you start another cycle. So and that's my conception of the way of knowing. The ways of knowing are many. When we engage those ways of knowing, we discover new knowledge every time we peel one layer of the onion.
Is it possible to ask a question?
Of course.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I have a, sorry, is that the right way to come in? I just have a question. I don't know.
Yes, please go right ahead.
Just follow up on that. I have one comment and two questions. The first comment is actually, it's a recommendation that I think we should go further and criticize, as has already been mentioned before, science as such. And there are fantastic work. Just want to mention one, David Turnbull. He talks about science and other indigenous knowledge system. And his argument is every knowledge is local. Science is also local. If you think about the laboratory, it starts with a very specific case and then it tends to be general. But basically, the idea would be to challenge all kinds of knowledge and remind it that it's actually local knowledge and not universal knowledge. But building on that, my question would be now, how can we think of institutions that allows a diversification of knowledge? I taught in my class at the University of Cambridge, I taught in my class about indigenous knowledge and in the sub-Saharan African context, and the one issue was if the higher education institutions that gets kind of more expanded, given that there are not many universities there, isn't there also a risk of a new form of colonization and basically even more to the detriment of local knowledge? So how could we think of different knowledge structures that allows for more diversity, and science and universities might not always be the best place because it does have this imperial gesture of trying to explain the world. So my question would be, how could we think of different ways of, what kind of institutions would we need that allows more diverse, the reproduction of more diverse knowledge? And following up on that, what is the risk of a further digitalization that we kindly can observe? I'm very worried about that it actually means even more an imperial gesture of now we know the world and it's everything on the internet. So how could we use the digitalization that we're going to see probably even more given the current crisis? How can we address the risks and how can we strengthen a diversification of knowledge production? I think it's not enough just to have more indigenous academics in universities. It's absolutely important. I could not more agree, but it's not enough. We need more. We need to challenge universities as such, I would say.
Well, the question that you raise here is an important question, and yet we are doing that already. You know, just by introducing, just by making it possible to have an indigenous knowledge SIG, we are doing that. Second of all, is that by developing a vocabulary to be able to explain to the academy what we mean by indigenous knowledges or research in indigenous knowledge, and feel comfortable in your skin as an indigenous person to sit before your committee, your doctoral committee, and convince them that you're on to something, on to a discovery of new knowledge, a discovery of new knowledge that is attached and connected with a cultural heritage knowledge. I think that's the step that we need to take. Now, multicultural education in the university, in the academy, is part of that. You know, it's part of that. And if we cannot can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
We can hear you.
I lost the picture. Do you see me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
And
All
see
right.
you. Yes.
Let me find. Yeah, I can't see you anymore. Something happened.
I think we can all hear you and see you.
Okay, fantastic. I'll just keep on talking then.
Yeah.
So what is going on here is that is that, my friend, you ask how can we engage in the diversification of knowledge, and how can we engage the institutions that we work for, that are the cradle of nurturing the new scholars, the next generation of scholars, in ways that they do not reproduce the colonial knowledge, but rather diversify that knowledge. How do we engage the academy so that there is a space for indigenous knowledges, for indigenous research, for an allowance where that is comfortable to be the opposite of the mainstream. Because you see, all sciences, they were minorities before they became the mainstream. And the struggles that they fought were to engage like minds to assert the language, the vocabulary, the science, the evidence, so that others can be convinced. But I think you said something very interesting here. You see, you cannot operate in a vacuum. You cannot digitize in a vacuum. You cannot diversify in a vacuum. It has to be within the existing. And so I wrote a paper one time about the existentialist view of indigenous knowledge and science. That actually we are part of the existing science. And unless and until we are able to connect the history of science. You see, there are many places they don't teach the history of science. But I think for anyone teaching in Africa, at an African university, you cannot avoid teaching about the history of science in Africa. You cannot ignore, because then that science, chemistry, biology, or physics, will not have anchor, will not have any foundation. I wrote a paper called Integration of Ubunifu in science education, in STEM science. And I got criticized for in that paper. And the challenge, I think, was someone was trying to plant into the thinking that when you talk about African science, indigenous science, it is not grounded enough. You know, it's not grounded enough in methodology, in theory, in theoretical framework, and it's not, and the evidence is not backed up by science. And if you look at that argument lightly, you might think then, well, we should give it up. But in fact, it's exactly what you are trying to tell us to be aware of, that you can buy into the same vocabulary, the same language of the academy, and through that, you are co-opted to begin to see your scholarship is substandard. Now, or I think digitization is a good thing. It has enabled us then to go back to our sources and feel comfortable in the way we communicate the information, in the way we communicate our hunches, in the way we communicate our dreams, in the way we communicate our local ways of knowing and acting and doing things. and I can go on and on and on, but I think my point here is to highlight the main strokes, the big strokes of the way we need to think about this area of study.
Have a comment and question, may I?
Yes, please.
Yes, well, to Taleni, thank you so much. And I don't regret the hair loss, because the outcome is what we care about, and I appreciate the outcome, the mere fact that you're here bringing us together. So it was worthwhile. But my comments, I will limit them to few. I have many, but because there are several of us, is about the in-reach, outreach concept. I have a colleague here, she's a Native American, and I remember a comment she made once in a meeting, in a seminar, and she said, now that I have tenure, I feel free to say this. Because if she had said it before she got tenure, they would have thought of her as this person lost in the past, doing folklore, that well, entertaining, but not really rigorous work. And the powers of the system that is in place, that impose itself on the others, and would like to continue to do so, and has many soldiers recruited to do that, or discouraging you. Very briefly, when we were choosing the theme for which you, Ladi, Martial, I circulated to have input about even using the term Ubuntu, the concept. You have no idea, or maybe you know, you have an idea of the incredible resistance that I met, as if I am going to bring something negative to CIES, which is the site of the minds, those who think of education, who produce knowledge, and to bring it to that level, as if I was going to spoil it. Well, we don't have time, but I could talk about it for an hour. The different forms of resistance that I encountered. Those who were saying, oh, you know, if you do it, nobody will come, because they will think it's just African. You see, it's full. The connotation in that, that statement alone is about Africa. Therefore, why do we use concepts and words that are not African, but we think they are universal, represent everybody, and everyone should come to discourse, to participate? But my question is, or comment, and if you can reflect on it, is the consistency. Is not enough to produce the knowledge as an academic, but also to practice, to bring that position, that knowledge, those ways of doing things, those ways of producing knowledge, those perspectives. A year ago, not less than a year ago, actually, Ladi, we were in where were we? We were in Bellagio.
Bellagio, yes.
Bellagio. When two major universities, Tsinghua and Beida, Beijing University, organized this meeting on a dialogue toward a new global aid regime. So what I appreciate every time I meet Ladi in different contexts is that he doesn't have a space for producing knowledge, and then other spaces where he would act normal, in quotation mark here. is the consistency. How do we, especially with the new generation coming, how do we strengthen the scholarship? How do we make it known? And, hi, Jose. And then also argue, articulate it. It's not this concept, tradition, modernity, you bring it in, it's traditional, these are folkloric things on the side. As you said earlier, indigenous knowledge has gone through thousands of years, you know? So if you can speak a little more about that aspect, that ways of thinking is not for the past. Our way, the indigenous knowledge helps us navigate, as you said. We were not supposed to be even alive because of the force with which the system came to extract all sorts of resources and control. So if you can say something about that. And then the other comment is this risk of co-optation. We're dealing with, I teach here at Cornell University in Africana Studies and Research Center that went through terrible, difficult struggle to even accept the idea that academia could accept something like Africana, not African, not African American, not a diaspora, Africana, meaning that that's a collective, unified existence of reference. And then the problem that was encountered later, once they didn't succeed in making sure that it would not exist, even by name, the challenge was, let us mainstream it. And the danger of mainstreaming, it means you have to accept all sorts of principles and live out what made it really worth fighting for. So if you can address those two aspects, both consistency, research, and the debate, and how we live our lives as academic, as a public intellectuals, and also the risk of co-optation and control.
That's interesting. That's interesting. You call, I mean, you make me have all these memories from the past. And I'm not sure I want to confront my past. But it energizes me. It gives me energy. It gives me this feeling of being young again. Look, the issue here is it's contradictory. It's a contradictory term between indigeneity or indigenous knowledge or indigenous education and the academy. The two clash because one is conceptualized. Indigenous knowledge is conceptualized as something of the past and frozen in the past. And that's where it belongs, and that's where it needs to be. And the academy is where all these new things occur. You know, discoveries occur, innovations occur, digitization occurs. You know, like everything else has to stop, or this is only where there is life. Actually, when you look at the academy, who makes the academy? It is people from all sorts, and they bring all these different knowledges to the academy, and the discoveries, they never put a demarcation between what is from your cultural heritage knowledge and what is your Western academic knowledge. It is a melange. It is a hybridization. And that hybridization is what actually makes this world going. So in terms of consistency then, it seems to me you have to have a thick skin to, and I'm sure that's what happened at Cornell. That's why Africana was able to survive. You have to have a thick skin. When I introduced at Penn State the notions of thinking about indigenous knowledge, I was on the front page of the local newspaper. And several of my colleagues asked me, will you survive? Are you sure you want to work at this conservative white institution? Actually, I was naive. I was naive. For me, it was the passion that I had for indigenous knowledge. I didn't care about what they were thinking. Only much later on, a colleague who came to join me as an expert, only to begin to bring in members of the academy like him or her to persuade me that there's no such a thing as indigenous. And I knew, and then some of my own colleagues in my department went to the dean and said, oh, Ladi wants to study indigenous knowledge. Dean, do you know what indigenous knowledge is? And so consistency and persistence, I think I should add, are important, because I knew that was my survival. If I can stay on focus, if I can continue to forge the language to explain the conceptualization, and I'm telling you today, it's everywhere on the in books, and journal articles are popping up everywhere. Not at the time when we started in 1992. So there is consistency and persistence, because then, because of my passion, I was able to begin to look for the words that explain the things what it is, and also create new terms, new terminology. I like the notion of Africana. I like the notion of Ubuntu. I like the notion of Ubunefu. Ubunefu is not discovery. It's not innovation. It is something in between. And we don't have a word right now, and just like Ubuntu, that really can conceptualize what it is and what it means. So we keep on, step by step, little by little, you know, and making inroads and making it clearer and clearer and bringing it into focus. The second thing is cooptation. Cooptation, I think that's the fear I have at this moment about the young scholars, about because you see, a young scholar, like the graduate students that we have on this panel, on this panel of discussion, when they come up with a topic and they want to study that, they have to go through an advisor. And that chair of that committee, if he or she does not buy into or is not imbued with a broad mind of what the academy stands for, is likely to tell you, to derail you, to say, well, you will not be able, there is not enough literature to support what you have to study. So my advice to you is, as you go into the topic, also try to find like minds. Universities usually have lots of people with diverse knowledges. And if you are open-minded, and if you work hard enough, you will find people who support the idea of indigeneity, the idea of indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing. And please try to have a group at your university of people, support groups that you can put on a talk, for example, where you can talk about this whole notion of storytelling and stories. Research is about stories. Come on. It's about telling stories.
Exactly.
It's about stories. So how come now research has a different caliber? Is a different caliber of knowledge, caliber of ways of knowing, or methods, all this. This is only a way to co-opt. It's part of that co-option. And colonialism, the main agenda of colonialism was to co-opt. That's why they killed the language of indigenous peoples. They say it is extinct. They creolicize. They say it's a Creole. It's a Creole. It's a vernacular. It's a dialect. You know, all these vocabularies. Now, you have to insist that it's a language because it's spoken by people, not by individuals, not by families. And if you look back into the history of this country and how the indigenous peoples were treated and how they are treated today, you know, will tell you that if we accept to be co-opted, then our identity, our origins, and our cultures will also be subsumed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I will make it try to short. I wanted to go back to the notion of integration and hybridization and attraction and expansion of the knowledge, because I don't want to be saying that it's cases everywhere. And Marshall, you can chime in because you and I live in the same geographic area. So what's happening in Canada is that if somebody is integrating in indigenous knowledge, so call it, whether in their education or curriculum development or research, there's a huge funding opportunity. So what's happening and where we are is that whether you're indigenous or non-indigenous, they're more inclined to learn and integrate, so call it indigenous knowledge, into their work. In a way, pros is that, well, now we legitimize indigenous knowledge into academia. Cons is that the opportunity of this exploitation, appropriation, because the communities that I worked, how you access knowledge is different from how it's working within academia, right? Because you have to learn the language, you have to have a relationship with the knowledge holder, and then you have to gain story, but stories are so multifaceted. And then some people without that relationship, because there's so vast of journal articles and books you mentioned, they access this knowledge and so-called stories from the particular community, and then without actually visiting the community or talking to anybody from the community, they access that knowledge and they use that and hybridize and then make it a new term. So I wanted to ask a question, Dr. Semali, because as a young scholar who I don't even like the word ally, friend of indigenous people around the world, how can a young scholar and a SIG, all of us, can make sure that there's a different set of protocol and ethics in working with the indigenous knowledge system? And in a way, who has a position to hybridize the indigenous knowledge? Like, is there yeah, that's my question. Like, my concern is that not everyone can do such job. They cannot, I don't think, I think there's a danger of just accessing the knowledge through the journal article and then hybridize without actually giving the ownership to the particular community of the knowledge. So how do we actually bring that hybridized knowledge back to the community?
Yeah, very good. That's a good question, actually. And your question goes back to what we talked about, enrich and outreach. And enrich is the knowledge of the community being valued at the academy, and outreach is the discoveries of the academy being applied to solve problems in the community. So, the question you're asking then is, how can we indigenize the curriculum? How can we integrate indigenous knowledge into the curriculum when there is a vacuum, there is a space there? The there is a space, an empty space there, because the knowledge holders are not part of the knowledge construction, are not part of the knowledge production. When you hybridize and you bring in new terminologies, that's not a bad idea. that's not a bad idea to bring in new terminology, because when you bring a new terminology, it makes the academic community to pause, to think what it is that you're trying to represent. Now, the representation of knowledge, unfortunately, it comes with lots of things. It comes with the language itself, in which it is embedded. Like Ubuntu, when you say Ubuntu, you know, it's embedded in a language. And so you got to get to know that language. You get to know the history of that language. You get to know the people who are the knowledge holders of that language. You get to know the what I call the artifacts that support that notion or concept. You see, you understand? So it comes with many things. So it's not a bad idea at all. And through that type of what I call a you know, it's a mental analysis. It's a mindscape. You know, that's mindscape. You know, of that helps you to navigate through Ubuntu and what it stands for, and the people it stands for, and the language stands for, and the history stands for. Connects you to the knowledge holders. So we're talking then, this becomes then a meta language project. You know, it has evolved into a meta language project, which is actually very much needed today for Africa, because they assumed that the colonial language, English, French, Portuguese, etc., was everything. It had everything. Let me tell you something. I was a chair of a conference in Africa, 2018, I think it was, and it was at an African university, and I volunteered to be the chair of this conference. And by the way, those proceedings are available online. This conference was on behalf of the African Association for the Study of Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And so as a chair then, I was able to influence what the theme of that conference will be. That goes back again to your question, Andre, about consistency, about persistence. By volunteering to be chair, I was able then to show not only the members of the academy, but also to show them how to run a conference differently that incorporates in-reach and outreach. That the academy people are there, but also the people from the community are there, so that their voices can be heard. Now, so the theme of that conference was Indigenous Knowledge in Africa, ways of being, ways of knowing, acting, and reading the world. And that brings us back then to what I was telling you about. When you use a term like Ubuntu, you have actually discovered a meta language in which you are able to pull together the science of the academy and the science of the community, which we call indigenous knowledge.
Well, I'm going to be that mean person who unfortunately has to bring a very engaging and rich conversation to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Semali. As always, you gave us so much to think about. A lot of ideas generated here, a lot of unended and unconcluded thoughts that I'm hoping that we can all continue to marinate on and reflect on as we go. Our recording will be available probably through our Twitter outlet and also our Facebook group. If you came in late and you want to get the recording and you're not able to get it through our social media channels, feel free to reach out to anybody in the SIG for that. But my head is spinning in so many different directions because there's a lot of things that I have to think about here. And I think for me, what I really appreciated, Dr. Semali, is that your focus on how do we extend the conversation? How do we engage up and coming scholars who are just either in school, about to graduate, or some of us who are just at the beginning of our journey? How do we continue that conversation? Co-opting is a big word that when it's said out loud, we can identify it, but when we are immersed in a situation, we are not often able to see that we're being co-opted. So I'm very appreciative that you're able to bring that concept out. So thank you everybody again for participating in this. I was happy to be part of this conversation, and I'm gonna hand it over to our co-chairs, Rebecca and Mong, to close us out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tutaleni. And I echo Tutaleni is that thank you, Dr. Semali, for such an inspiring and engaging and stimulating conversation. I think that this probably we will have opportunities to explore each and of these topics in our future 6 sessions or meetings, and we will have the opportunity to guide and work with our members to position our SIG within the academy as well as within the broader society in general. So thank you everyone, and for excellent questions. And we will, as Tutaleni said, we will make this available in the social media, as well as if you do not see it, please feel free to contact me, Rebecca. We are SIG chairs, as also Renee, Jennifer, so we will be happy to contact you. And in the future, please feel free to contact us. We try to organize webinars on a bi-monthly basis. And many of you, I think that we will be happy to hear from you and even share your wisdom and experience with us. So thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day. And with that, I will stop the recording.